Our scripture reading today comes from the first chapter of Genesis. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." God said, "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree will seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning on the sixth day.
Well, before beginning the sermon, I just wanted to offer a word of thanks on behalf of myself and Melanie and Ariana and Marin and our family with the passing of Melanie's mother this last week. We really appreciate we didn't make a big deal of that happened, but word somehow got out, and they've had a lot of cards and letters and just a beautiful bouquet of flowers at her funeral on Friday, and we thank you for your outpouring of love and support. And given that was an unplanned but not unexpected trip out of town this last week, I had the choice between creating the sermon manuscript, which I've been creating and finishing that up, or doing slides, and I chose the sermon manuscript, so you can read a copy if you'd like. But that also means, unfortunately, all you've got to look at is my pretty face during the sermon. So on that note, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Have you ever overheard a very excited and engaged telephone conversation that somebody's had and then tried to figure out what the conversation was about? I mean, sometimes you get it pretty easily, but other times it's quite difficult. They may be quite animated. And you think, well, what's causing that? Unless you know what's on the other end, you don't. Or maybe you kind of think you know what's being said, but you don't really know unless you had that other voice. You are able to overhear that other voice on the other end. Well, I think oftentimes reading the Bible is like that. It's like we are overhearing a very excited and animated conversation, sometimes expressing high joy, sometimes anger or emotion, and so forth. And sometimes it seems pretty clear what's going on, but other times, not so much. It seems like something's missing in translation. Well, often it's because the people who wrote the Bible were in excited conversation with somebody on the other end of a figurative telephone line. They were in conversation with ideas and thought forms, even a text from the ancient world that we are not privy to. And so sometimes if you find yourself reading the Bible and you find it confusing, anybody ever find that? Maybe not. Maybe it's just me. But find it confusing or obtuse or wondering why are they getting so excited over this? He seems so little or what have you. Oftentimes it's not your fault. It's not because you're so dim-witted or spiritually unsophisticated that you just don't get this. And it's also not their fault. It's not that they're too primitive or just not clear writers. Oftentimes it's because they're actively in conversation with somebody that we're not hearing. And as we step into this series, we're going to, if you learn anything else, you'll learn that it's kind of dangerous to form great conclusions about the Bible and solidify them into church doctrines as if they came down from on high based on hearing only half the conversation. Sometimes we've done that over history, and we receive these doctrines and dogmas, and they fall into commonly held Christian assumptions, only to find out later that maybe that was founded on a bit of a weak or shaky foundation. One of the preeminent examples of that happening, actually, comes in the doctrine of original sin in the church. Now, before you get excited, this is not a sermon series to completely debunk the notion of original sin. It's hard, if you look at lived human experience, it's hard not to get away from the fact that, or it's hard to get away from the fact that we are flawed. And there doesn't seem to be an exception among us who are alive today, that we are all flawed. We all fall into sin. We all are imperfect, and we never quite live up to the ideals that we ourselves even espouse. So it's not about that. But if you take a look at this doctrine of original sin, there's some problems here that we need to address, and they're fundamental problems that affect you whether you believe in the doctrine of original sin or not, because that doctrine has influenced all of Western civilization and our understanding, our core understandings of what it means to be human. Now, in case you're not just up to date on church doctrine, original sin, its origins came actually, the Hebrews never believed in original sin, even though the origins come from Genesis, the first opening chapters of Genesis. It didn't really come about until the 2nd century, and then was popularly espoused by Augustine in the 4th. But our received notion of original sin largely was formed by the Reformers, especially John Calvin in the Great Reformation. He argued that we as human beings are born inherently sinful, that we lack fundamentally the ability to reconcile with ourselves with God under our own power. And he, like many others before him, turned to the Genesis creation story, particularly the story of Adam and Eve, to found this doctrine. He noticed that Adam and Eve, they received paradise. They had perfect free will. And what did they do? They willfully disobeyed God's command by eating from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so given that they had perfectly free choice, and God had given them this gift of great, this wonderful paradise, and they willingly turned their back, they created, according to Calvin, an infinite offense against God. So infinite, infinite's a long way, right? So it was such a great offense that offense could never be made up for in a human lifetime. And therefore, if God's justice were to be served, there needed to be punishment that would make up for that infinite offense and dishonoring of God, an infinite punishment. Therefore, we are all condemned from the moment of our conception to punishment, eternal punishment. And the way we escape that is that in Christ came and lived a perfectly sinless life and willingly took on the punishment that we ourselves deserve. And therefore, if you believe in Jesus and accept the sacrifice he made on the cross, then you are given a pass. Christ has fulfilled that punishment for you. The rest of us, bad end. Now, that is the doctrine as classically espoused by Calvin. But and even if you don't believe in that doctrine, even if you don't believe that we are born inherently sinful, or that we are going to hellfire and damnation if we don't believe in Jesus, likely that doctrine affects you. And the way you could do a self-check on this, actually. Ask yourself, do you ever find a voice inside your head that suggests, or rather insists, that you're a failure, that you will never amount to anything, that you're a fake, that if the rest of us really know who you are for real, that you would not be welcome in our midst? Or does a voice ever suggest or insist that you are a raving egomaniac to ever think that God could take delight in you? Or that God could have created you for a high purpose, a high plan, and could actually enjoy seeing you in action, even if you're just vaguely coming to terms with that plan, vaguely living it out? if that voice ever occurs to you, it's not created by the doctrine of original sin, but it is definitely fueled by it. And so before we simply accept an assumption that our tradition has given us, it's often good to check the presuppositions. You check the premises, check the starting point, because it's amazing how, if you ever notice, if you set out on a journey from point A to point B, even if it's a straight line, but if you're just slightly off, the longer you go, the more far away you are. And those who assert a notion that Jesus saves us from our sin, from eternal punishment through what he did on the cross, many who hold to this doctrine, it's all created because of original sin, this idea of what happened in the garden. What happened in the garden, what didn't happen the way we think? Many will argue if there is no such thing as original sin as classically espoused, then the whole cross is worthless. Jesus, in fact, is worthless to us. That being a community of faith is worthless. I have to wonder, really? Really? The whole thing, the whole Christianity is worthless if Jesus didn't save us from eternal damnation? That's the only thing that Jesus is good for? That's an example of starting out with the wrong premise and getting farther and farther off the longer the assumption is made. This series is going to be about checking our assumptions and tracing their implications for our lives, for the world, and for our lives today. And happily for us, in the last couple of centuries, we've been given for the first time in Christian history a chance to check those assumptions. Now, not everybody's wild about checking those assumptions because sometimes assumptions are hard to give up. But in the last couple of centuries, thanks to archaeologists and linguists and biblical scholars who have dug up texts throughout the ancient the location of the ancient Near East, we have come across the other side of the telephone conversation in many cases in the Bible. We're actually able to hear the conversation, overhear the conversation in both directions now. And that's really deeply interesting for those of us who care to recheck assumptions. And with original sin, we're going to track quite a lot. To give you a that by it could be called sin, not Calvin described. We obvious this to any of us. We perfect individuals, some sort of original alienation from easily more sexually. Called original. Will show. We are original race. And that's what unraveling discoveries and weeks. Genesis. All aware that one get into the there are two accounts through the and then and that's the first one. God rest immediately for create Genesis, and you'll find more than other chapters. very at home is open up the book of Genesis. The order. It's not weak light, but their purpose wasn't to write down a factual historical account of creation, describe the who, what, when, where of creation. Their purpose was to describe the why of creation. Ultimately, they were after describing the relationship between ourselves and God, ourselves and each other, and ourselves and the earth. And they were using story to convey that. Story that contains what might be called mythological truth. That is, truth that keeps repeating itself over and over again so we can actually find Genesis in our lives today. That's how deep the truths go. Now, Genesis 1 is rather interesting because we know a lot more about the context, that telephone conversation, than we ever did before. For instance, we have a very good idea about when it was written. Now, if you were to take a document from American history that just simply came out of the blue, it would be kind of helpful to know if it came from the Civil War era or the Civil Rights era or World War II or just yesterday. I mean, it kind of gives you an idea of the context. We kind of know this more about Genesis. That text, that first creation account, was written during the most traumatic time in Israel's history in the Bible, that being the great exile in Babylon in the 6th century. In 586 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar, he had come down from the north and absolutely decimated every city of any size in Israel, and after a multi-year siege, finally succeeded in laying waste to Jerusalem itself, which was their political and religious capital. Every stone was taken down, and even the great temple where Yahweh was believed to be enthroned invisibly above the Ark of the Covenant, that was completely destroyed. The Ark was taken, probably melted down, lost forever. I mean, it was a traumatic experience. If you want to even get to, vaguely within, to feel what it would have been felt like to the Israelites to have experienced this, picture 9/11, except 9/11 happening in every city in the United States of any size. And not just 2 buildings coming down, but all of them. Okay? Then imagine after 9/11 that anybody who had had any kind of wealth or power or schooling was hauled off into exile. Couldn't live in the United States anymore and was hauled off to wherever to live. That is the great exile that the Jewish people experienced in the 6th century. Amazingly, all kinds of literature in the Bible come from this very time period of the exile. The prophet Jeremiah wrote before and during the exile. The prophet Ezekiel was one of the people taken into exile and wrote from exile. A whole portion of the book of the prophecies of Isaiah come from the exilic time period. The book of Daniel was written not during the exile, but the story takes place in the exile. The books of Lamentation and Job are both responses to the exile. And huge portions of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, were either written or edited during the exile, including our first creation account. Why was all this literature flourishing during the most dramatic time in Israel's history? Well, look at your own life. When do you do the most spiritual soul-searching and flourishing? Is it times when you're riding on top of the world, or times when the bottom drops out? It was during the exile that people were asking those fundamental questions about life and who we are and why we are. And why God is, or if God is. They really had to honestly answer, had Marduk, the high god of the Babylonians, defeated Yahweh? The Babylonians were like, yeah, of course. Look at our wealth and power. Look where you are. It's obvious, isn't it? Marduk's in control, not Yahweh. And they had to ask themselves, just as we asked after 9/11 even, why did this happen? Could this have been avoided? Could it happen again? Could we do anything to avoid it happening again? And what does this imply about our relationship with God and each other? All those questions were very much alive and buzzing around during the exile. And, of course, the Babylonians were happy to give them plenty of answers. Yes, Marduk was in control, and supply them with their theology, which they felt was the right one. And one of the answers they supplied was contained in a text known as Enuma Elish, which was the Babylonian creation epic. They had their own mythology of creation. And they not only taught that mythology, but they reenacted it every year in a great festival in Babylon. So it's hard to miss. Enuma Elish was everybody knew that great story. But yet it was lost to us thousands of years ago, but refound in the 19th century and translated and handed on to us. So now and it's amazing, if you know a little bit about Enuma Elish, you start to overhear the conversation that those ancient Genesis writers were having when they wrote their own creation account. So what you find is that there's actually a lot of similarities between Genesis 1 and its story of creation and Enuma Elish. For instance, creation takes place in 7 stages in both narratives. Creation starts on day 1 with chaos, and then the overcoming of chaos and the establishment of order in both narratives. In both narratives, the high God creates something out of nothing, creatio ex nihilo in the classic Christian formulation. They'll follow roughly general things happen in each one of those 7 stages, including on that 6th stage, human beings are created. And human beings are created from, now this is a suggestion for Genesis 2, scooping up the clay of the earth. Human beings are formed of that clay. And on the 7th day, the 7th stage of creation, there is celebration and rest amongst in heaven. Because there are amazing similarities. Probably the reason why there are so many similarities is because the ancient Hebrews accepted portions of that narrative as probably happened that way. After all, that story of Enuma Elish actually was about 1,000 years older, if not more, than they were during the exile. It had been told for centuries. So they basically said, okay, yeah, here's the basic ways creation must have worked. But what's really interesting is when you hear the differences then, in light of all the similarities and the way they were obviously in communication, when you hit the differences, it makes what they're saying even more pronounced. Because they could have just bought into the Babylonian line, but say, wait a minute, in this instance, this does not match our experience of our God. So we don't think it happened that way, we think it happened this way. And that's where the conversation gets very interesting. So, for instance, one primary difference between the 2 accounts is in the Babylonian account, it starts with chaos, just as in the Hebrew account, except chaos now is depicted as an evil monster, a sea monster actually, named Tiamat. She's an evil monster that must be defeated by the gods. She wants to take over the gods, and they have to kill her. So in the Babylonian account, creation starts with violence, with warfare. In the Hebrew account, where's the violence? Where's the warfare? Not there at all. Chaos is there, but chaos is simply neutral and completely subservient to Yahweh's one word of command, let there be light. And effortlessly, chaos is set in order. It's like what the Hebrews are trying to tell us is that violence is not creative. Violence never creates anything good or godly. And of course, those Hebrews, they'd experienced that, hadn't they, during that great exile. They knew firsthand, violence is never a creative act. I wish more of us would remember that today and hear that message. Another primary message, difference between the accounts, is that human beings in the Enuma Elish are, yes, they're created from that clay of the earth, but what happens is they've slain Tiamat, this evil sea goddess monster, and they've taken her blood and they combine it with the clay. They mix it with the clay, and then from that human beings come out. In other words, according to the Enuma Elish, human beings are created with the blood of an evil God. We are inherently evil, not good, or a mixture of good and evil. That's where we come from. Whereas Genesis 1, now bear in mind, we're going to get to Genesis 2 later. That will show us some other things. But in Genesis 1, there's absolutely not any suggestion of human evil whatsoever. In fact, there's no mention of sin whatsoever in Genesis 1. Humanity, when it comes to humanity, we are created according to what? The image and likeness of God. Now, in the ancient world, that was an outrageous claim. That just kind of rattles off our tongues these days. Oh, yeah, we're creating God's image and likeness. Well, yeah, big deal. Yeah, really? In the ancient world, there was only one person that was created in the image and likeness of a deity in any culture. Who was it? Not Jesus. They didn't believe in Jesus. No. The king or the emperor. That was the only person who's created in the image, or thought to be created in the image and likeness of God. The Hebrew narrative is saying, no, that's all of us. All of us are created in God's image and likeness. We are all royalty. That's what the Hebrew narrative is saying. Finally, another difference. The reason why humanity is created in the Enuma Elish is simply to be slaves of the gods. The gods didn't want to work so hard. They wanted to create this army of people who could simply do the work, make sacrifices, and so they could basically go on permanent vacation. That's why we exist. Be slaves. Genesis account, what does Genesis 1 tell us? Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the earth and the seas and everything. Now, we in our day, we have a hard time with that dominion language because we insert it in our own cultural context. We know that if you simply run rampaging across the earth saying, well, this is ours, that creates problems. But listen to it in their context as a completely defeated people who are surrounded by a narrative that's saying, you are meant to be simply a slave of the gods. And what's it saying? What they're saying is, God is not a slave master. God, in our experience, is a liberator. If you get connected with God, you are liberated from bondage, not enslaved. And in fact, any sign that you are enslaved is a sign that you are not part of, you are not connecting with the God of our experience. So once we pick up the phone, we hear both sides of the conversation. We hear some pretty interesting similarities, but we also hear these very interesting differences. Violence is not creative. Human beings, we are created closer to royalty than anything else. We're created in God's very image and likeness. And that if we connect with this God, it always has a sense of liberation and empowerment. Interestingly enough, that doctrine of original sin, has espoused that we are inherently evil and that we are enslaved to our sin. That sounds a bit like Enuma Elish, doesn't it? The very thing that Genesis 1 was written to counteract. Now, next week, we'll read Genesis 2, and we'll hear a slightly more pessimistic view of human nature espoused. Really, if you take Genesis 1 and you're only to say, well, royalty and we're all liberated through God and all sorts of, you'd think you'd never be able to describe where a Holocaust comes from. You'd never be able to describe where a Spanish Inquisition comes from, or where 9/11 comes from, or these shootings that have been plaguing our country. You'd only ever think we're just up with people. Isn't it nice and warm and fuzzy? You kind of get that impression from Genesis 1. We're going to hear a different story in Genesis 2. But what Genesis 1 should at least tell us, and I think we just kind of rest with this for the week, is that you cannot even start to discuss original sin until you account for original blessing. Original blessing. That ultimately it comes down, we are marked by blessing before we are marked by anything else. And that yes, there is more to that story, but that's an important and critical piece of that story, both for Christian theology and for those little thoughts that race around our heads. Amen.